Hello, welcome to Good Questions, Good Answer. Today we have another interesting question from our audience in the response of the situation happening in America right now. What does the Buddhist respond to this violent case? Today we have Venerable Sander joining us to help us solve the problem. Are you there, Venerable Sander?
Yes, I am. Thank you for having me on the program.
All right, let's get on to our questions.
Yeah, there is very serious incident which you just mentioned about the way that Floyd was treated by the police,
Mm-hmm.
and there have been protests all over the world about this. Even
Yeah.
in my country, 5,000 people have gathered together in Amsterdam to protest about this issue. I think, as Buddhist monks, we can say some. I'm making statements here in general about all sides of the problem and also about how we as human beings in generally can improve ourselves. So just having put that out of the way, I would like to say that violence in Buddhism is not seen as just a bad person doing something.
How
It's more
so?
than that.
Mm.
So, so in the West, we tend to think of violence as a moral issue only. And when a person is bad, he's violent. And when a person is good, he's not violent.
Okay.
Um, I think that problem, that approach is a bit dated now. And I'm happy to have, I'm quite happy to have heard about the work of an epidemiologist
Mm.
who formerly used to work in preventing illness and disease from spreading in countries like, for example, Ebola in some African countries.
I see. Can
And
you?
his name is Gary Slutkin. Now,
Okay.
his view of looking at violence is very similar to the Buddhist view, but he has also tried to change his career by not focusing only on physical illnesses, but on mental illness in terms of violence.
Mm.
So he's actually training people to interfere when gangs are about to kill each other. So in the same way that Gary Slutkin sees violence as an illness, Buddhism sees anger as an illness.
Okay.
So anger, greed, delusion, all of the failures of the human mind and heart are actually illnesses that we can deal with by
Mm.
making our mind stronger than and more resilient than that.
I see.
But the part of the process is to recognize that every human being in the world can be susceptible, can be affected by the illness of anger, greed, and delusion.
Right.
So in rather than dividing the world into good people or bad people, or if you want to divide the world in terms of race, color, or other superficial features, we should look at rather than as a problem of all human beings that we have to struggle with. Then the reason why violence is so problematic is very important to understand. The first of all, violence quickly can destroy everything.
Right.
So violence can destroy your goodness, your good qualities.
Mm-hmm.
So in Buddhism, violence is often compared, and I mentioned this in our previous session about forgiving and forgetting. So it's a very bad thing, and it also very much causes us to our good qualities to be lost. So
Right.
whatever good qualities we have of patience, compassion, all of that can be destroyed if we are giving into anger and violence and cynicism. So the second thing is that violence causes us not to see the other as a human being.
Mm.
So this is, I think, this can be very clearly seen in the case of America, but I won't go into detail about that. I think people can fill out the dots.
I think so
But
too.
but yes, but in the Buddhist stories, this is very obvious. There is a conflict between the two clans.
Oh
The
yes.
clan that the Buddha used to be part of before he became a monk,
Yeah.
and those were called the Sakyans. You know
Yes.
about them, right?
Yes, I know about them, but can you recall me a little bit about what are the conflict between the two and how did they solve over this matter then?
Yeah. So there were the Sakyans and there were the Kolians. And the Sakyans, they saw the Kolians normally as neighbors, but there was a certain point in time in a certain period when water was scarce,
Mm,
where the water was getting scarce and was getting less, and there was not sufficient water for both of the countries, both of the
mm-hmm.
clans.
Right.
And then the Sakyans they started to accuse the Kolians, and the Kolians started to accuse the Sakyans.
Mm,
And then they were considering to wage a war on each other, to start to fight each other. And the Sakyans they said the Kolians they are not really human beings, because the Kolians they built their huts in trees just like the monkeys do or something like that,
mm,
or just like the birds do. So they started to justify their anger against the Kolians by comparing them to animals. The Kolians they did the same to the Sakyans. They
mm-hmm.
said the Sakyans they all have incest with their family members, because the Sakyans sometimes they had marriage between nephews and nieces.
Mm,
So therefore, the Kolians they also said the Sakyans are like animals. So we can wage war on them. They are not really our brothers. They are not really human beings. So in the same way, we tend to justify any conflict, and it always must be justified. You know, if you want to legitimize any war, any conflict, there's always somebody who has to come along at a certain point to say why the other person, why the other party, why the enemy is not really a human being. You know,
mm,
so we have to find, people are going to find this kind of terminology, which is very much a lie, to try and compare the other person with not really a human being. And then the thing is that the Buddha, he tried to prevent the conflict.
mm. Just like this guy
And
doing, Mr. Gary.
right. And then they were about to fight each other on a large field. And
Mm-hmm.
then he sat at the middle of the field. He sat under a tree. And then the Sakyans and the Kolians, they didn't want to wage a war when there was a monk sitting in the middle. So they went to see the Buddha, and they said this tree. They were trying to be polite. They said, "Venerable sir, this tree is a bit small. Maybe you should move to another tree. There is not so much shadow here." In other words, could you just get out of here, because I want to fight my enemy. And then the Buddha, he said a very famous phrase in Thai Buddhism. He said, "I am sitting in the shadow of my family. I'm sitting in the cool shadow of my family." So he was actually not hot at all. He was not, even though he was not sitting in any shade, he was sitting in the middle of the sun. But he
Mm,
said, "I'm very happy because I'm sitting in the shade of my family." So, and then when the Sakyans and Kolians were still considering to fight each other, he asked them, "What is worth more in your lives? The water about which you're fighting, the water for which you are fighting, or the blood of your own relatives?" So when you're going to wage this war, your family is going to die. You're going to lose all your loved ones. What is worth more to you, their blood or the water for which you are fighting? So
mm.
of course they said the
Yes.
water of our relatives is, the blood of our relatives is more important.
Right.
So they stopped the war.
Mm,
And Gary Slotkin, he teaches people in a similar way. He will say to them, "Why should you kill the other member of the gang, the other gang member, the other kind of gang,
mm-hmm.
when you know that your children and grandchildren will have to suffer the consequences?" So he always points out the consequences, just like the Buddha did.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think he's aware of Buddhist perspective on nonviolence, but he uses very similar methods to the Buddha.
Right.
And the Buddha, he didn't do this only once, he did this in several occasions. So the thing we fight about is often worth less than what we lose in the fight.
Mm-hmm.
That is another problem with violence. So right now, many people are angry towards each other, and that is not only about the incident of Floyd, the fact that there is a lot more going on in America. And
Mm-hmm.
we have to ask ourselves all the time when we're getting into conflict, especially when it's violent conflict, are we losing more than what we aim for? The
Mm-hmm.
same way the police needs to consider themselves, not only the protesters, of course, everyone needs to consider as soon as they engage in violence, is it really worth the end? Just do the means really justify the end?
Mm. Well, you also have to ask yourself too, is it worth for the consequence that you are about to face? Because you're gonna lose a lot more than you gain.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is mostly these are leading by our anger or emotion. And sometimes we lost the cause of why we were fighting for. Sometimes,
Exactly. Yes. So at a certain point, we just forget about the cause. That's also happening.
right.
Like in the time of the Buddha, there's actually one other incident when the Buddha asked people who were having conflict. He asked them what it was about, and then no one of the soldiers or the warriors that were engaged in the battle
Mm,
knew what the conflict was about. They were just following orders.
right. That's
And then eventually the question went up into the ranks, and eventually only the most senior people who gave the order knew what the conflict was about.
yeah.
I mean, how can the level of pigment in your skin or the color of your skin determine the value as a human being? That is just not a biological reality.
Mm.
It's not possible that the color of your skin is in any way responsible for your actions or in any way determines the value of yourself as a human being.
Right. Can you suggest any way how we should solve the problem in the peaceful way?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to realize that violence destroys ourselves the most.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We might think that when we are angry with somebody, we should, act on that anger sometimes because otherwise things don't get solved. But we should not forget that some of the great leaders who solved problems of social injustice were actually very strong proponents of nonviolence. Look at the example of Gandhi.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the example of Martin Luther King. These were very strong proponents of nonviolence. They were not giving in at all when it came to violence.
Right. Mm.
So Gandhi he believed in nonviolence not only as an idea in to solve social injustice, but he believed it as a part of his spiritual practice. And
I
this is
see.
very similar to Buddhism. The word that he used, ahimsa, which is the word for nonviolence in Indian language, is
Mm.
actually very similar to the word that we use in Pali language, which is avihingsa. Avihingsa and ahimsa is the same word. It
Mm.
simply means that we do not hurt another person, whatever we want to achieve.
Mm.
So there is actually a story in the Jatakas in which a very good king, is mentioned.
Oh, what's the name of the
And
Jataka?
the name of the Jataka is the Raja Owata
Oh,
Jataka.
Raja
Or,
Ovada. Okay, I see.
yeah,
Okay.
Raja Owata Jataka. And in this Jataka, there is two kings. Both of
Okay.
these kings are very much praised. They're
Yeah.
very much honored by their citizens.
Yeah, they were
But
equally in everything. Yes.
yeah, according to the story, they are equal in many ways. And then at a certain point, when the people, their
Mm-hmm.
close assistants start to compare them, they discover there is a major difference.
Mm.
It turns out that one of the kings, when he tries to solve anger in his country, he solves it by more anger, and he
Mm.
solves When they meet bad people, he solves it by treating them in a bad way. In other words, to imprison them or kill them.
Mm.
And and then when somebody, when somebody speaks lies, he just tries to fight them with more lies.
Mm.
So all of these things are not very good, nice ways of dealing with people, but that is how he had become so well known as a king.
Mm.
But the other king, which was even a better king, he says when he meets with anger in society, then he will deal with it with kindness. So he says, his assistant says about him, he conquers wrath by mildness, the bad with goodness sways, by gifts the miser vanquishes, and lies with truth repays.
Mm.
Give place, O driver, he talks to the other assistant. Such are this monarch's ways. So
Yeah.
there is actually a number of examples that the Buddha mentioned in the Buddhist text
Mm.
about being a good king in those days and also being a good governor. And it always comes down to encouraging the rich to give to the poor, giving himself as a king
Mm-hmm.
to support certain projects of the poor, of the farmers, and encouraging good initiative. It's always about giving and encouraging.
Uh-huh.
And problems in society, such as violence, are always seen to come from poverty and other limited opportunities. Of course, in Buddhism, we do think that violence always has a character component as well. I mean, if you have bad habits, it costs you to be violent if you have bad habits.
Mm.
But it's also recognized very much that violence and other problems in society always are caused as well by lack of economic development, lack of investment. That is what the Buddha says about that as well. So
Mm.
many people, when they think of Buddhism, they think this is about a monastic religion, which doesn't talk at all about how society should work, but it only talks about getting rid of society, withdrawing from society, or something like that. Is the sort of propaganda which is sometimes talked about or which sometimes mentioned. And this is the idea that many people still have, but in fact, Buddhism in many Asian countries has a very engaged manner of dealing with society, and many things the Buddha taught about how
Yes.
to set up a good society. They can still be found in the early text.
Is there any other practice that we can do to help improve our quality of our mind? Maybe we can get rid of the anger, because sometimes when we are gaining victory over the enemy, sometimes it may not be a good victory according to the king's story that you mentioned earlier. But what about now when this situation comes? What should we conquer instead to be the honor as true victory and solve the uh, maybe find a better situation, find a light for this matter?
There was a story some time ago in China, and there was an earthquake. And in this earthquake, the many schools they fell apart. The school buildings they collapsed.
Right.
So this was a very serious issue because many children died.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that in those areas there were already many regulations in place as to how schools should be built so that they wouldn't collapse when there was an earthquake. But it turned out that when the parents that were angry about that, when they investigated this problem, it turns out that they actually discovered that many of the owners of the schools, many of the directors of the schools, had paid bribes to the government officials so that they wouldn't have to renovate their schools, so
Mm.
that they wouldn't have to adjust the school buildings or build the school buildings a little bit easier, so it was cheaper. So they just thought of their own self-interest and the short-term thinking, and they didn't think about the children who might die in an earthquake. So
Mm.
when there were many protests in the country, many people in those days still were able to access Twitter, and later on the Chinese government banned Twitter. So when people started to contact each other and held many protests, some of those directors of the schools, they felt so bad that
Mm.
they actually bowed for forgiveness in front of the protesters. And you can still see pictures of that online.
Mm.
So there is this, and eventually they try to improve the situation.
Okay.
So it's not always a matter of violence that can solve things. Eventually, just pushing for an agenda in a non-violent and good way can sometimes also solve a problem. Now we
Mm.
have to ask ourselves, as soon as we start to use violence as a method of trying to accomplish what we want, whether you are the person who is in power or you are the person who is protesting,
Mm.
then you're going to lower yourself. When the police is engaging in more and more violence, they're going to lower themselves. They're going to be similar to the people who they try to put into prison. When the protesters are going to be more and more violent, they're going to lower themselves to the same people they are actually criticizing. So violence is always going to lower ourselves. So
Mm.
that's why people, as I mentioned, you need to have this good motivation. Another thing that is very important in Buddhism is that we have to realize that every conflict we engage in, and all the people that we hate now and that might hate us in return, this is not going to end in this life. And we should take that into account if we consider the possibility of reincarnation or rebirth.
Mm.
Then all of the things that we engage in, they will come back to us. So there are different ways that we can deal with problems. We can, of course. I'm not saying that it's always wrong to protest. I'm not saying that all police is wrong. I'm just saying that we should use wisdom when we deal with things. And
Mm.
it's often so easy to say that patience is always a weakness, because that's what people are always going to say. The people who do not understand spirituality, who do not understand the Dhamma that we talk about, they will always say that patience and wisdom is weakness. But
Mm.
as we know, that is not the case. Patience is not weakness. Actually, patience, even
Yeah.
if people see it as weakness, is a strength for our own heart and a human mind, and eventually it will come with better solutions. But
Right.
we have to keep talking and trying to find a way to understand and to understand each other. Because when we are engaging in violence with other people, we eventually forget about the most important struggle, which is the inner spiritual struggle to improve our character and our human being.
Right. Yeah. So basically, what you are saying is that we have to keep our mind be strengthened by with patience, and also with goodness, a virtue that will be need to instill in the mind to allow the mind to see the reason and see the consequence of the violence that's gonna happen, causing by ourselves when we make an action, or or when we take action. So
Right. If you look at the example of Martin Luther King,
yeah,
one
right.
of the reasons why he was actually accepted so widely is because he was able to prevent violence.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to guide people's anger in a constructive way rather
Okay.
than admitting to anger just directly. He would
Right.
just use the people's activity in a more constructive and compassionate way to try to really focus on the suffering of people now, to find a solution to that suffering by engaging into some sort of way to communicate with the government.
Right. So before we take an action, what we need to consider most in ourselves is put ourselves into their shoes. So this way
Right.
we understand them completely, and
Yes. Violence
therefore,
is always an illness, and everyone can be subject to that illness.
right. So we can have compassion to everyone around us, or even though if we don't know them, but if we have compassion, we would not do something that causing us to have regret later.
Right.
So in this case, we should also conquer ourselves, our own anger, right?
Right.
So do you have
So
the
there's
story that you want to
yeah,
go
there's a
along with this?
story about that as well.
Oh yeah,
There's
go on.
one. There was actually one Buddhist monk who was into conflict with himself, because he, in one side of the story, one part of the story, he wanted to be a monk. But one part of him also wanted to still lead the life of being a farmer, being a worker, and he was always in conflict with himself. And eventually he became a monk and then disrobed, and became a monk and then disrobed again and again. And eventually he was able to conquer himself. He was able to make the decision that he was going to live the life of a monk and not fall back. So he threw everything away that connected him to his previous life. And then he said the words, I have conquered, I have conquered. Or in Pali language, chitang me, means that that he had actually conquered the limitations of his own mind. So eventually,
it's very deep meaning.
Eventually a king came to see him because he wanted to know why he was shouting these words, chitang me, because these are the words that normally, sound very dangerous for a king.
Right.
And then that king, he asked about it, and then he explained that he said, though you may conquer many countries or many battles, you may be victorious in many battles, but the real victory is the victory of the heart.
Right.
So that is so important to Buddhism, that the struggle, the real struggle of human beings is not the struggle between each other, but the struggle that every human being faces to be a better person, to be a good, beautiful, and wise person. And to really struggle for that is the real challenge of all human beings.
As you may have suggested for the Buddhist case of for non-violence, this is quite also interesting and also give us some light of how can we settle this matter down. Especially we have to conquer our mind, letting our anger be gone, distinguished from the heart. So this way we can understand ourselves, and before we take any action, we must consider into putting ourselves into their shoes. If we do something like this, would they like it? If they do something to us, would we like it? Like this, consider this more truly. Therefore, we won't make or take any action that could cause us to be regret or facing consequence later on in the future. So that's everyone. When it comes to violence, remember, stop your anger, control yourself, put yourself into their shoe. In this way, you will find yourself in a peaceful solution and find solution to move on with a peaceful future. Thank you very much for watching our good questions, good answer. Thank you, Brother Sander.
Thank you.
We hope to see you again in the next question. Good questions, good answer. See you again next time.
Thank you very much.